Welcome to the Innate Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Loren Sofia, healer of my own fertility and health struggles, mother, functional fertility coach to thousands of women, and owner of Innate Fertility. I believe your body is innately wise, and so is your fertility. Sometimes we just need the tools to unlock it in abundance. I'm honored to guide you through each episode where we'll cover not just fertility, but how to rediscover the innate wisdom of your body, restore your connection with your physiology, bioenergetics, and metabolism, and get back in touch with Mother Nature and ancestral traditions. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Arden Cartrette, certified birth and bereavement doula and trauma support specialist. She's also known as the Miscarriage doula on Instagram. This episode is dear to my heart for many reasons. First, as somebody who specializes in fertility and preconception, miscarriage is something that I inevitably come across. The most quoted statistic is that it happens to 1 in 4 pregnancies, but if you actually speak to midwives and doulas, it's much higher than that, as high as 1 in 2 confirmed pregnancies. And when you start to think about the pregnancies that go unconfirmed, well, it might be actually much higher than that too. So if you're on your trying to conceive journey, this is absolutely not to discourage you. But whether it's your first baby or your second, third, or fourth, you may have experienced pregnancy loss or are in the process of experiencing it. And I just want you to feel seen. That said, for some reason, the support available to you or any woman going through this is abysmal, and it's something that is rarely spoken about. Remember, the statistics I just mentioned, it happens to a lot of women, and most women won't ever say anything about it. And it's even taboo to speak about, which just goes to show you how unspoken this thing is. And if you're using the conventional medical system, miscarriage can be even more traumatizing than it already is. This is something that I've personally worked really hard to change, but Arden has too, and I'm so grateful that people like her exist. And I'm so excited about our conversation because of this. In this episode, we're going to discuss the misconceptions around miscarriage, what to expect when you're experiencing one, how to support yourself through one, our own personal loss stories, and so much more. I want you to know that if you're experiencing loss or have experienced loss, that you are absolutely not alone. I'm here for you, and Arden is here for you, and so are the many women that have gone through this too. And hopefully, the information in this episode meets you where you're at and supports you in ways that you didn't even know you needed. All of this said, it kind of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I do want to make sure that you know that the content in this episode may be triggering. So please, it's here for you if and when you're ready. Now on to the episode. Welcome everyone back to another episode of the Innate Wisdom Podcast. And I'm super excited and honored to welcome Arden from the Miscarriage Doula on today's episode. Welcome, Arden.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I am such an admirer of your work, and I think it's just so important, especially, coming from the fertility space myself. And I think it's, the work that you're surrounded with is something that doesn't get enough, spotlight, or it's, something that people tend to kind of shy away from. And so I'm super excited about today's conversation because I think it will be really powerful and helpful for a lot of women out there.
Yeah, sadly, I don't think society is comfortable with the uncomfortable. So they like to not talk about things that are, that are kind of dark and morbid and terrible things that are happening to people. They like to shy away from that.
Yeah, it's an avoidant trait,
Yes.
so to speak. But I appreciate, you championing that work because it's serving a population of women that really need it. So, well, just in case anyone listening is not familiar with your work, would you mind sharing more about, who you are and what you're all about?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you said, my name is Arden. I am in North Carolina, but I work with people all over the world as a bereavement doula, but I focus on pregnancy loss. And I have actually been doing this work for many years, but didn't realize what I was doing, if that makes any sense. I started a fertility blog in 2017 because my husband and I were trying to conceive and it wasn't happening. And I felt alone. I felt really depressed. I felt embarrassed. And so I started blogging. I'm a creative writer by nature. That's usually how I process things. And I made an Instagram for the blog and I met the most amazing women who were all like looking for support on Instagram as well. So through my fertility journey, I blogged, I made friends in the infertility community. And then we got pregnant in 2018 after a year and a half of trying to conceive. And I went into that pregnancy thinking, like, oh, somebody doesn't experience infertility and loss. You know, those two things don't happen to a single person. And I still was so naive. So then that pregnancy sadly was a miscarriage. It was a situation where we went in for the first ultrasound and we were basically given the news of this doesn't look great, but we can't say for sure that this is a miscarriage. Come back in a week. And then we did 3 weeks of pregnancy limbo, as I call it, because every week they thought maybe they saw some growth, but they weren't sure. And it was agony. I opened up about it through my blog. I still wasn't super public. The blog was actually anonymous until I had my first miscarriage. So having my first miscarriage, I was physically 11 weeks pregnant. I tried to find any information online. I think I Googled every possible key term you could possibly think of. I looked on forums. I searched high and low for somebody to tell me what to expect because I was really scared. And everything just said a heavy period. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I can handle that. Maybe that'll be fine. But the more I thought about it, the less I wanted to do it. So I did talk to my doctor about having a D&E because it would actually be cheaper than having a D&C in an OR. And so we scheduled that, but because the universe just laughs at me for some reason, the night before my scheduled D&E, I actually had my miscarriage at home. And my experience having my miscarriage at home awoke some part of me of like, nobody told me that this was birth in the first trimester, and nobody told me that this would cause me trauma. Nobody offered me resources, support. My doctors didn't even call me. You know, I had no follow-up. I felt so isolated, and I was really angry about that. So through my blog, I put my face on the blog. I no longer was anonymous. I started talking very loudly about miscarriage. I wrote my story in detail, like in grave detail that is hard. I don't think I've reread it to this day because it's hard to relive. And I just didn't want to stay quiet about it. And so I started talking very loudly about miscarriage. I did go on to have a second miscarriage, which only made me angrier and louder. And so from my second miscarriage, I basically started telling people on Instagram, if you learn that you're having a miscarriage and you want to know what to expect, ask me and I will tell you every detail. I will give you my phone number. You could call me in the middle of the night. I don't care. And so I actually started becoming a miscarriage doula without realizing that's what I was doing. I was just kind of lending a helping hand. My second miscarriage was even more traumatic than my first because I thought I knew what I was doing, but every miscarriage is different and I did not expect that. So again, I felt very blindsided. But to fast forward that way, I know I can ramble about my story forever. We did a bunch of testing. We learned literally nothing. And my doctor was like, let's just try and get you pregnant again. So we did fertility medications and I did get pregnant again. And I had my first living son from that pregnancy. We did a couple of things different, but nothing that for sure, banks on anything. And pregnancy after loss was yet again another really difficult time that I felt like nobody prepared me for, and I couldn't relate to other pregnant people. I felt really alone again. So after he was born, it was the beginning of the pandemic, and I finally felt like because I had a living child in my arms, I felt ready to really give people the support that I wanted to give them, but I kind of held back because of my own triggers. So I started the coursework to be a birth and bereavement doula, thinking I would help people through pregnancy after loss because I didn't realize that I could help people through miscarriage. And through my schooling, I realized that there's even less about first and second trimester losses. A lot of the bereavement side of my schooling was stillbirth and infant loss, which is also very needed, but there was a gap missing. And there's a lot of people in that gap who need support. So I embarked on learning as much as I possibly can. Something about me is anything I am remotely interested in, I will learn to a T. I love research. I love reading. And then I also had my own experiences that kind of covered almost every basis. And so in December of 2020, I started the Miscarriage Doula, where I just basically was like, I will meet with you virtually and prepare you for loss or help you process loss. And it's grown into, sadly, a very big resource for a lot of people. We have groups, we do one-on-ones. I also now provide education for other doulas. That way they can support people through miscarriage. So it kind of snowballed from my own experience into what it is today. It took 5 years to really be comfortable to give my full support to people.
Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. And I think a lot of the most beautiful things end up coming from the most painful things.
Yeah.
And this is certainly one of those situations. And, you're offering that extension to other women going through what you've been through. And it's just, again, it's so needed because, as we said, it's just something that's completely avoided or, kind of skirted around. And I so appreciate, this kind of, even though, you experience such great loss, there was still a birth of some other kind happening in the background too.
Yeah.
Which is a different way to look at it and definitely not the same. But
yeah, it's so complicated. And I think I talk about this with people a lot where people feel conflicted because maybe they feel closer to other people in their life because of loss or grief, or maybe they feel closer to a community. Maybe they learn something about their fertility through having a loss, and they wouldn't have known that if they didn't have a loss. Like, there's so many elements of where we can grow or learn, and it's complicated because, of course, we don't want to go through loss to get there. But I say pretty strongly that I like who I am today versus who I was before I experienced loss. I'm a better human. I'm a better mother. I mean, overall, like, I just feel like I'm a better version of myself. I was naive and uneducated, and I had no idea of any of this stuff. And while that's a privilege in its own way, I do sadly like the empathy that I gained from it, as morbid as that sounds.
yeah, absolutely. I myself have experienced a loss some time ago, and I felt the same way. It was just, no one could really prepare you for what you're actually going to experience. And it was just, it was very lonely also. But, the people that I found it really difficult, this is actually the most difficult part about it. I found that the people who I shared it with, a lot of them had their own opinions and projections, and, trying to, their way of like navigating the situation was just completely not what I needed, or not what I needed to hear. There was also this sense of entitlement from certain family members about when I told them and how I told them, and like, oh, I can't believe you didn't tell me until now. And
so crazy.
it was mind-blowing in so many ways, not just the emotional and physical pain, but also just the social aspect. And I also had really positive experiences too. I made connections with friends that I have today because they experienced the same exact thing and they felt the same exact way. And you were able to, really connect with somebody who knows exactly what you've been through. And that was really powerful, I felt too. But it was just so interesting. And I don't think anyone could have prepared me for what exactly was going to happen, even though I knew so much about loss as well. So I feel like it was honestly, a valuable lesson for me as well in the way that I show up for my clients too. And I do feel like I'm a better person because of it as well. And again, it doesn't diminish the loss itself and the hurt and the pain. This is just how I've chosen to process it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I've learned that people will say anything except for just like, I'm sorry, that sucks. They will try to fix it. They will try to diagnose you. They will tell you to stay positive. In a recent support group that I held, we talked about exactly what you shared of how family was like, my gosh, why didn't you tell me? Like, I didn't even know you were pregnant. Why didn't you tell me about your pregnancy? And like, it's so bizarre that as humans, we naturally make things about ourselves. And I think that before I experienced infertility and loss, I think I did that. I mean, in conversations, I think I thought I was relating to somebody or adding in my 2 cents. And I thought it was welcomed because that person was having a conversation with me. And that's not really the way that the world works, right? Like, we can have conversations with somebody where we just listen and we don't provide any information other than our like undivided attention and support. But again, we're so uncomfortable. We're uncomfortable with death. We're uncomfortable in silence. I think loss makes us get a little bit more comfortable with those things.
Yeah. And it's almost like opening up this other, I don't know, I feel like it opened up this other layer. It expands you in some way, whether or not you want to be expanded,
Oh yeah, it's not by choice.
Yeah. But, you do have this sort of expanded perspective, and yeah, you're able to kind of navigate those situations as well, or those topics with a little more just experience too, which, sometimes just experience is illuminating and so powerful. So even if it's not the one you wanted, but I so appreciate that. And yeah, I think this is why we're here and chatting today. So
well, and thank you for sharing about your loss. I think you mentioned it was some time ago. And I think that another misconception about loss is people think that there's like a certain time frame where it's like their loss is no matter, like it's no longer worthy of being the drive for something or hurting them or feeling grief from it. My first loss was now 5.5 years ago. And I could still be brought to tears over just reliving the night that I had my miscarriage. And it's oftentimes that in doing this work, I'm triggered and I need a second. I think that loss doesn't leave us. And I even have people who are maybe a month after loss and they're like, it's been a month. Why am I still so sad? And I'm like, because time does not fix this. This has happened to you and it's an everyday effort to cope. So I love that people continue to speak about loss, even though it's been longer than the 2 to 4 week, time period that I feel like society gives us to grieve.
Yeah, it's honestly ridiculous. I think it should be considered an actual, I think if you're working in the modern, I guess, system, you're not even you're given 3 days, I think, to grieve if you lose somebody, to go to a funeral. But I don't even think that's enough time. And then when you're, with child and you lose, it doesn't match up for me. And it makes so much sense because there's a lot of literature coming out that also just shares women who have experienced loss previously have a high likelihood of having PTSD for a while. They have a high likelihood of having depression, psychosis, but especially PTSD. And, I think I personally still have some. It's something that I've worked through.
Yeah.
But it's just something that again, like you said, it doesn't really go away. It's just something that you learn how to cope with. You see things in a different light. You have ebbs and flows. It's never linear. It sticks around longer than I think most people would like to admit.
It does. And I think I know if we're thinking of the same study, because there's a study I often reference of people who tell me that they are feeling like symptoms of postpartum anxiety and depression after a miscarriage, because I firmly believe that we are postpartum after pregnancy loss and that we go through all of the same symptoms, which I found very triggering in having my first living son, because I was like, whoa, I have had some of these things before. In that study, if I recall correctly, it's like they do it increments of 3, 6, 9, and then I think again at 12 months. And there was like a spike at the 6th and then 9 month, which is similar to how postpartum anxiety and depression is diagnosed. It's usually spiked between 6 and 9 months because it's very hormone driven. And so I fully believe that a lot of people suffer from PTSD. I was diagnosed with PTSD after my second loss, but it was definitely a lot of what drove me to get diagnosed was from my first loss. And it was something that took a really long time to work through. I'm still in therapy. It comes up whenever I have my period. It's one of those things that doesn't just leave us. And I'm very thankful for the doctor who pointed out that I had signs of PTSD, because I would have never asked for help for that.
Oh, wow. That's really great that you were able to get that kind of support, because I feel like even doctors in a doctor setting, at least the ones that I saw after my loss, just to kind of check in,
Yeah,
they were also super avoidant and
they
just
are.
kind of almost embarrassed. They the questions that I had, they were kind of like, they turned red and tried to answer the questions as quickly as possible. And I was just like, okay, if I can't even talk to you about this, who am I going to talk to? Like, it was just very fascinating to go through the
Medical system.
I mean, personally, I haven't had the greatest experience with the medical system, so I try to avoid it as much as possible. But I just, I wanted to make sure, I wanted to do a couple of things just to make sure post-loss, like making sure I didn't have any infection or of some kind.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy you have to ask for that?
Yes.
I was never offered a follow-up either. It was a primary care physician that I saw about not being able to sleep. I had gone many nights without being able to sleep because whenever I closed my eyes, I saw blood and I had like all of these really severe symptoms. And she recommended that I see a therapist. And luckily for me, the therapist that I saw was, she's a psychiatrist and she's still my psychiatrist today, which is amazing. And she's experienced loss. She experienced infertility. So she was very empathetic to it from the very beginning. And I sadly think that was key, because other people definitely downplay it. I've even had OBs today where with my second living son, I struggled with some of my PTSD triggers in that. And they were just like, oh, well, that doesn't really make sense because this pregnancy is different. And I was like, you don't understand the way a brain works when it's traumatized. So it can be really difficult, and it sucks that it's so difficult.
Yeah, even this pregnancy too. I don't know if you know, I'm 8.5 months pregnant right now.
Oh my gosh. I could never tell from your face. If I were doing this 8.5 months pregnant, I looked like a balloon. You look great.
Thank you. I've felt really amazing. But as much as I've felt physically well, and I think I've learned a lot of lessons, and one of the hardest for me has been learning to mother myself, but also just pregnancy after loss. As you've mentioned at the very beginning, it's been, also just knowing how much I know as well. I feel like
yes,
that has
it's
been
hard.
very difficult to just knowing so much about fertility and pregnancy, and, all of these things itself can throw kind of like, I don't know how to describe it, but ignorance is kind of bliss in a sense.
Yeah.
And the opposite can be maddening.
For sure.
There's that, but also just having experienced a loss previously, I think that there's another layer of like a lot of work that I've really, or things that I've contended with mentally during this pregnancy that maybe, women who get pregnant for the first time and it goes, they are able to deliver a living child without loss previously is different mentally in a lot of ways. So that's been very interesting for me as well.
I wish I could shed light on it, but my experience is the same, where my losses happened before my living children. And my entire pregnancy, I remember thinking, do other people feel this way? Like, are people afraid on a daily basis? Are they worried to say when the baby comes instead of if the baby comes? If they're worried about all of these things that literally make my doctor, like you said, turn red. That I think I experienced it the most in pregnancy after loss, where doctors felt really uncomfortable with my concerns and questions. And knowing too much is definitely, it's a good thing, right? Because we can advocate for testing if we want it, or like other things. But it also, in my experience, harmed my mental health to know as much as I know with my fourth pregnancy, because ignorance is bliss, and we don't have the opportunity to be ignorant anymore because we've been through too much and we know too much.
Loren here. I hope the content in this episode has been resonating with you. If you're trying to conceive and currently looking for support in the midst of a miscarriage or looking for ways to prevent it in the future, I want to let you know that I'm here for you and that I have created resources to help you specifically. I want you to be equipped with the information you need when you need it. And in my course, Conscious Conception, I walk you through the numbers, the types of miscarriages, what to expect when miscarrying, how to support yourself through one, how to recover from one, what you need to know about trying again post-loss, the reasons they happen, and proactive steps you can take to prevent them, everything you need to know about recurrent pregnancy loss and how to prevent them, and more. You're not alone, and I am here for you. You can email my team at innatefertility@gmail.com for more information. Now back to the episode. Yeah, I can definitely resonate with that. And I think at this point too, a lot of women are just a lot self-advocating a lot more too and becoming informed. So,
Yeah.
there's that extra layer of, 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. So there's that aspect. But, how many of those end up in losses, and these women have to go through exactly what we went through anyway. And so there's a lot more, I feel like there's a lot more need to discuss these kinds of things, and probably a lot more women that feel the same way as we have in the past than we realize.
Well, and I think it's a great point to bring up that half of pregnancies are unplanned. And a lot of the women that I talk to, I find that whenever somebody has a miscarriage of an unplanned pregnancy, sometimes I think society thinks that means unwanted, but that's not true. It's just that maybe they weren't preventing, but weren't trying, and they got pregnant, or it could happen so many different ways. And a lot of times there's an added grief with that because they thought their life was going one way, and then they had these plans for this baby, and then they lose that baby. And so it's like, it's kind of whiplash. And so I think that all of our individual stories also really play a big role in our grief, because I like to say that we have secondary losses of loss. So it's like pregnancy loss is our main loss, but we have all these other things that we've lost. And while we might relate on some of those secondary losses, a lot of us are going to have secondary losses that are unique to us that we can only understand. And then we have to help other people understand it so they can support us. And that is draining. So then that's another loss, because that's like a loss of your energy with, being social. And there's just so much to it. And I don't think that doctors often take into account those things. Sometimes I've heard terrible comments from doctors of like, if somebody did have an unplanned pregnancy, it's almost like, well, good thing this wasn't a planned pregnancy. Or I've heard the craziest things. Or in the midst of my first miscarriage, I had a nurse ask me if this was a planned pregnancy. And I wanted to ask her, like, does that matter? Does that change this outcome? So I see that like interfere a lot in the miscarriage space, which always bugs the crap out of me because it does not matter.
Mm-hmm. I think that's well said. I think that's really well said. It's that aspect, and then also the commentary that you get afterwards too from people that is just shocking sometimes. But, I think maybe for anyone who has never experienced a loss, maybe it would be helpful to kind of go through what to expect, just to kind of, and I can share my 2 cents as well, but I'd love to kind of walk through what to expect.
So if somebody has never experienced a loss, and say they're preparing or they're going to experience loss and they find this, one thing I tell every person, that even no matter how your miscarriage is going to happen, whether you are hoping to have a D&C, whether you are taking the medication, or whether you're waiting for it to happen naturally, buy all the supplies needed to comfort yourself. Have it in your home. And like the worst case scenario is you have too much and you don't need it. And so some of those things that I recommend are adult diapers, extra long maxi pads, it sounds kind of bizarre, but I tell people to get like extra t-shirts, or to buy like men's briefs. And the reason is that way you don't bleed in your own clothes. That way you don't traumatize yourself of your own clothes and outfits. Like you can throw out these items. It's just about being comfortable. I didn't do that with my first, and I could literally never wear the outfit that I had on to bed that night again. And that was another aspect of my personal trauma. I also think that I usually tell people a heating pad, but a good backup is to get the hot hands that like construction workers use, because you can put them on your stomach if you're in the bathroom and you don't want to plug in your heating pad and wait for it to warm up and all of that stuff. That could be a good immediate release. Along with, I tell people either Gatorade or liquid IV, something with electrolytes, because you're preparing for birth, essentially. It's just a very sad, morbid birth that you did not expect to happen, that should not be happening, but unfortunately is. So I tell people to stock up on these things and to never be afraid to ask your doctor for a pain reliever, even if it's a controlled substance. If you're comfortable taking a controlled substance, it's not a crazy request to have a hardcore pain reliever, because the pain is pretty bad. With preparing for loss, so there's so many ways I feel like that loss happens too. I can share from my experience of it happening on its own. I started spotting, and it took 5 days of light spotting until what I call the worst of it happened. Scientifically, a lot of times the worst of it actually happens in the middle of the night because of like our hormone shifts, which I think is kind of crazy. But the same thing is with birth. A lot more women go into labor in the middle of the night. So you could spot for multiple days before the worst of it happens. And I say the worst of it because sometimes there's a misconception that bleeding is the actual miscarriage, and that's not 100% true. Miscarriage also looks different for everybody. Some people do have, periodic bleeding and don't experience the worst case scenario, which is usually what I prepare people for. But in most cases, you spot for a few days, and then you will start to feel that your cramps and your contractions are just getting harder and heavier. It's, again, quite literally like a birth, where it's like you notice that you're contracting. And then after you probably contract for a little while, again, it's different for everybody, the bleeding will become heavier, and you will have blood clots that are pretty large in size. Whenever I tell people what to expect with a miscarriage, anatomy-wise, what happens is we give birth to two essentially very large sacs. Sometimes it could be one sac if it's both sacs put together. A lot of times it's two. And what that is your amniotic sac and your gestational sac. And so that is peak pain. You're going to feel intense push, like the sensation to push, again, just like birth. And then I always tell people that the worst is over, because after that release, you instantly feel like a weight has been lifted. It feels physically like things, that the worst is over. I cannot explain it further than like your mind just knows like, okay, that was the worst of it, and you feel like a release. However, you will continue to bleed. And so I usually tell people not to be afraid to literally labor wherever is comfortable. A lot of people, that's the bathroom. For me, I went between the shower and the toilet, and that was most comfortable for me. That way I could have hot water, and that way I didn't have to like continue to clean myself, and I could just sit on the floor of the shower, and that was comfortable for me. Also, with my experience, I took Cytotec. It was a very similar timeline, except for it wasn't a complete miscarriage like my first one was. So I actually had many days of passing clots, which is sadly normal for the medication, but should not be deemed normal for us to experience. So yeah, I don't know if you have any additional things from your experience or anything that I'm not thinking of.
Yeah, I'd love to add some additional things from my experience, but also maybe what I do differently too in the future. So I actually had a blighted ovum, and it was a miscarriage as well. So it was no older than 6 weeks, but we didn't find out until 9 to 10 weeks, because I was just at that point mentally just like, I don't know if I can take this. I had been spotting, which is a very common, actually, symptom during pregnancy too. So, and I had been working with a midwife at that time, and she just encouraged me to, hey, it's normal, but if it makes you feel better, absolutely, we can get you an ultrasound, and just know that that's an option for you. And so I hung on as long as I could, because I was actually going to avoid any kind of early interventions, and I just couldn't take it by like 9 or 10 weeks. I think it was the 9th week. And so I got one. And then we went to the ultrasound, the center. My poor husband was like, I knew immediately when she was doing, the tech couldn't tell you anything. The tech can't tell you anything here in the United States. So if you're, in Canada or Europe, ultrasound techs are very tight-lipped because they can't interpret what they're seeing for you. It has to be interpreted by a medical doctor. But, as soon as I saw it on the screen, I was like, oh, this is not a viable pregnancy. And my poor husband was like, what's going on? What does this mean? And so I just left completely sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but defeated. And also just trying to prepare myself for what was to come. But also because I knew it was past 3 weeks past when it should have been, I was also trying to contend with, okay, what's my plan? Because I personally did not want to get a D&C. I didn't want to have to go through that. I think, for some women, it can be the exact thing that they need. But for others, and for most women that I know, it's been a really traumatizing experience to have to go through that. It's been its own kind of trauma. Granted, they can be life-saving too sometimes, but I just wanted to try to avoid getting one as much as possible. So I was like, okay, what do I know that I can do? And so my midwife, encouraged me to just keep tabs on things for about 2 weeks. And if I didn't pass within 2 weeks, then we would probably want to go see a physician, OB/GYN, to see what might be going on and consider that, or consider additional options. So amazingly, right before the 2-week mark is when I miscarried. And prior to that, I had started spotting, but really it wasn't spotting. It was actually releasing tissue. Like, I think it was placental tissue. So I had started releasing tissue, and then just one morning I was literally watering my bushes in the front yard. I just started bleeding profusely, and I was like, okay, this is happening. I ran inside. I could not, the pad that I had on, just mentally preparing for it, could not soak it up fast enough. I was just like, oh my gosh. So I started bleeding a lot, and that's something that I think people should know. I think it can go from like 0 to 100 very quickly.
Yeah.
And then the labor pains started to happen as well. And I labored for about 3 hours, and I went from basically the floor on my knees in my bedroom to the toilet, between the floor and the toilet. And I passed an enormous amount of tissue. I was in shock because, again, they say it's going to be like a heavy period, but it is.
I've had heavy periods, and and I think it depends on so many factors too. But yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, just an enormous amount of tissue, because I think by then I was 11 weeks and my body had continued to grow that placenta and grow my uterine lining, even though it was a blighted ovum. So I had a lot of tissue to pass, and it was just really surprising. And just as I was starting to feel lightheaded and being like, okay, this is not a good sign, maybe I should go to the ER, it stopped. It slowed down to a very light period. And I was like, okay, this is it, I think. The worst has passed, like you said.
Yeah.
And so from there, I experienced a different kind of pain after that. It wasn't labor pains or contractions, but this really strong burning sensation. Kind of like the I would say that was more similar to a heavy period for about 5 hours afterwards. And so at that point, I was exhausted. I took a nap on my bed, or I tried to, through this pain. And I had a warm water bottle, a bladder with hot water just compressed on my belly, drinking lots of liquids. I did take aspirin, which definitely, I would talk to your doctor. It does thin the blood. So if you do end up bleeding a lot, it's not something that you maybe want to take for pain. But I have been done bleeding, so I felt comfortable taking it. And yeah, I just focused on a lot of nourishment after that, or tried to eat. I really didn't have any appetite. I think things I would do differently maybe are prepare more for the loss. I had pads, but I didn't have that outfit. Even that outfit tip that you gave was just amazing because, even going into the bathroom, sometimes I'm just like, oh, this is where it happened.
Yeah.
And it's hard because you don't have so many choices a lot of the time. But yeah, I think things I would do differently, probably prepare a little bit more as far as like the mental aspect of things. Make sure to block out my calendar, honestly, for a couple of days if I can, so that I can have that emotional and physical time to recoup. And that's something that I didn't really prepare for. As a business owner, it's kind of difficult to take that time off, especially when you don't know it's coming. But it's definitely something that I would have done more strategically. The outfit's a great tip that you gave. I love that. Having the pads, having the heating, the hand warmers is also great. I kind of wish I had those on the toilet.
Well, I learned
for
from
sure.
not having any of these, to be clear. My first experience made me stock up on stuff, where I was like, now I need X, Y, and Z. And for my second miscarriage, I made like a basket of these items for myself. And then I also, from there on, started like leaving things like that at home in case I had another miscarriage. So it made me want to be a little prepared in a different way. And it's interesting because the men's briefs as a tip came from, I can't remember if we just like needed to do laundry or something. And I was like, I need to wear shorts or something. And it was September, so it was hot. And so my husband was like, well, I have these briefs that I didn't like. Do you just want to wear them? And I was like, yeah, that sounds good. And they were so comforting because they were like tighter shorts, on me. And from there on, like I would wear briefs when I was on my period and stuff. And so it kind of became this like piece of comfort for me. And so now I recommend to everybody, like, we should all be wearing men's briefs because they're very comfortable.
Yeah. I love it. That's definitely a great tip. I think also, depending on, your spirituality, or depending on kind of what you envision for yourself, how you want to remember this pregnancy, it can be helpful to figure out a way potentially to catch what you're losing. And, you could do that with a sieve. You could do that. They make kits for that. But I think if you do have the luxury, and I say luxury, obviously very cynically, but to think about this ahead of time, because sometimes losses just come and you don't expect them. But if you know that they're coming, it can be helpful to have this kind of kit so that you can, honor your baby in whatever way that you feel you want to.
I completely agree. Sometimes I tell people like some ideas in case that's helpful for the listeners to hear. Like if you feel comfortable naming them, it could be a name that would be their name regardless, or it could be a nickname, any of those things. Sometimes that's a really nice way for us to cope, but also that way we can acknowledge our baby. Making purchases, like birth flower art is a really big thing on Etsy. And that's some of my favorite pieces that I have with my losses. And other ones, like if you have an ultrasound photo, as painful as it is, Sometimes you could do watercolor paintings or something like that. Etsy has a lot of really great shops that are run by people who have experienced loss and now create art. And it's a really great place to find items for that as well.
Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful suggestion. I love that. I actually have a friend who specializes in this, who provides more of like bereavement kits.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. But I think, if you can think about that ahead of time, or even whenever you're ready afterwards, these things can sometimes help you in processing everything.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you so much, Arden. I know you have to run. I would love to continue our conversation.
I could talk all day, sadly, about miscarriage, and there's so many pieces of it. So I'm always happy to come back on and chat more. I feel like this was a good conversation for either anybody who's processing their loss experience and wants to know that they're not alone, or somebody who's going through loss and wants to be prepared. So I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And how can people find you and reach you?
I am on Instagram at the Miscarriage Doula, and my website is themiscarriagedoula.co. So it's not .com, it's .co. And I have a podcast where people share their miscarriage stories. It's called Miscarriage Stories, and that's available everywhere. I don't know all the platforms anymore. I just know that wherever I upload it, that's all it goes. I think that's all the places. I think that's how you can find me.
Well, thank you so much, Arden. Definitely, if you feel like you're wanting additional support, or just to even educate yourself on loss, go check out her resources. And again, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing everything that you did. And I hope that, as you said, it really helped somebody potentially in need listening, or if you know somebody and you're listening that maybe this would help, feel free to send this episode along to them.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Arden. Thank you so much for listening to the Innate Wisdom Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review and share the podcast with someone who you think might benefit. If you're new here, we can't recommend enough that you take advantage of my free resources, like the Get Pregnant Yesterday checklist, Cycle Literacy Guide, Prenatal Primer, and Sperm Booster Manual. And if you're trying to conceive now or in the near future, I invite you to join my pregnancy prep e-course, Conscious Conception. Make sure to follow me on Instagram too, at innate_fertility, and consider joining my newsletter to receive exclusive content related to fertility and so much more. A friendly reminder, the content shared on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be a substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.